The night glittered with champagne flutes, flashing cameras, and the restless heartbeat of Miami's elite. The Hale Foundation's annual yacht gala was supposed to be a celebration of success, an extravagant show of wealth cruising against the Atlantic's restless waves. The air smelled of sea salt, mixed with perfume worth more than a family car. Laughter rippled across the deck like music from another world, a world where appearances mattered more than loyalty. Lillian Carter stood at the edge of that world, her hand instinctively resting over the swell of her belly. 6 months pregnant, dressed in a pale silk gown that floated like moonlight, she looked fragile yet radiant. Her almond eyes scanned the crowd, searching for the only man she thought she could trust, her husband, Richard Hale. Richard, however, was nowhere near her side. The successful real estate magnate had become the life of the gala, his arm draped protectively, almost possessively, around Vanessa Brooks. The young brunette assistant glowed in a crimson dress that clung to every dangerous curve. She laughed too loudly, tossed her hair too boldly, while Richard leaned closer, whispering things that made her cheeks flush. Every flash of the paparazzi cameras seemed to frame them as the perfect couple, as though his actual wife were invisible. Lillian's heart stuttered. She had told herself the rumors were exaggerations, just whispers born from jealousy. Yet tonight the truth stood undeniable, paraded under crystal chandeliers and the eyes of hundreds of guests. Her throat tightened, but she forced her chin higher. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. The yacht glided further from shore, city lights shrinking into distant stars. Music swelled, violins and jazz trumpets blending with the rhythm of waves. Waiters weaved through the crowd with silver trays. Toasts were raised in Richard's honor. Vanessa clinked her glass against his with a smug smile, as though she had already won the crown. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard's voice thundered across the deck, amplified by the microphone. "Tonight is not just about wealth. It's about vision. It's about building futures." He paused, squeezing Vanessa's hand deliberately. "And it's about the people who stand beside us as we chase our dreams." The crowd applauded. Lillian felt her chest hollow out. She was the wife carrying his child, yet the man she had sacrificed her career for stood there, publicly crowning another woman as his partner. The deck tilted slightly as the waves grew restless. Guests swayed with laughter, too intoxicated to notice the sharp change in the wind. The sea roared beneath, darker than velvet, hungrier than any secret whispered tonight. Lillian took a careful step back, the heels of her shoes tapping against polished wood. Her vision blurred, whether from tears or from the sudden dizziness of pregnancy, she couldn't tell. She gripped the railing, desperate for air. It was then the chaos erupted. A loud crack split the night, the sound of a champagne bottle slipping, crashing against the deck. A startled guest stumbled, colliding into Vanessa. She screamed, her heels snapping against the wooden floor. In a blur of sequins and panic, she lost her balance and pitched backward over the railing. The crowd gasped, but Lillian, already unsteady, was too close. The sudden movement jolted her as another guest bumped into her shoulder. Her body lurched forward, and before she could scream, she too was falling. Two women, one carrying an unborn child, the other dripping with ambition, plunged into the black Atlantic. The world slowed. The music cut off, glasses shattered on the deck as people cried out. The icy water swallowed Lillian like a merciless beast, sucking the air from her lungs, wrapping her in darkness. Her arms flailed, her gown dragging her down, heavy as chains. Salt water burned her throat as she gasped for breath. She broke the surface once, choking, clutching her belly instinctively. Her scream ripped through the night. "Richard!" Above her, panic ruled the deck. People rushed to the railing. Spotlights swung wildly, slicing across the waves. And then she saw him. Richard, her husband, her protector. The man who had promised to love her in sickness and in health, till death do us part. He was leaning over the railing, toward Vanessa. His eyes locked on the mistress, thrashing wildly, shrieking for help. Without hesitation, he tore off his tuxedo jacket and leapt. Not toward his wife. Not toward the mother of his unborn child. Toward Vanessa. The ocean roared louder, like it too understood the betrayal. Lillian's world shattered as she fought to keep afloat. Her limbs grew numb, each kick weaker than the last. She tried to cry out again, but salt water filled her mouth. Her silk gown twisted around her legs, dragging her deeper. She saw flashes, Richard wrapping his arm around Vanessa, pulling her up like a hero in a romance novel. Guests cheered in relief. Cameras clicked. Lillian's voice, hoarse and desperate, was drowned beneath applause. She slipped under again, the cold cutting through her body, the weight of betrayal heavier than the sea itself. Her vision darkened, thoughts scattering. Not the baby. Please, not the baby. The last thing she heard was Vanessa sobbing against Richard's chest, and Richard murmuring, "I've got you, you're safe now." Not a single word for his wife. The Atlantic swallowed Lillian whole. And on that glittering deck above, beneath chandeliers and champagne bubbles, the woman who carried his legacy was forgotten. But fate was not done with Richard Hale. His choice would not vanish into the night. It would return, sharp, merciless, unforgettable. Because what he left to drown would one day rise. And when she returned, she would not come back as the fragile wife he ignored, but as the storm he could never escape. The waves had nearly claimed her, yet destiny had other plans. Hours later, Lillian Carter lay in a stark white hospital bed, her skin pale, lips trembling, body wrapped in blankets that could not warm her. Machines beeped softly, their rhythm a cruel reminder that another heartbeat, the tiny one she carried inside, was gone. The doctors had delivered the verdict in clipped, careful tones. The shock, the trauma, the cold ocean had cost her the child. She heard their words but felt them more like knives twisting in her chest. A sob rose, but she swallowed it. The world had already stolen too much. She would not let it see her break. Yet behind those silent tears was the story of a woman most people never truly knew. Lillian had not been born into luxury. She grew up in a modest neighborhood in Savannah, Georgia, where magnolia trees shaded cracked sidewalks and cicadas sang in the humid summers. Her father, a mechanic, worked long hours fixing engines. Her mother, a piano teacher, filled the house with music, even when bills piled on the kitchen counter. Lillian's earliest memories were not of wealth but of sound, tiny fingers stumbling across ivory keys, her mother's patient voice guiding her through every note. By the time she was 16, Lillian's gift was undeniable. She played Chopin as if she had lived through his sorrows, Brahms as if she had shared his fire. Scholarships carried her to Juilliard, where she trained among prodigies. Yet while others dreamed of Carnegie Hall and international tours, Lillian dreamed of something simpler: a family. She believed music could live in children's laughter, in a husband's steady presence, in a home filled with warmth. That belief had made her vulnerable. She met Richard Hale during her second year of college. He was older, confident, with a smile that promised the world. He spoke of skyscrapers he would build, fortunes he would claim, but when he looked at her, he spoke softer. "You ground me, Lily," he had whispered once, brushing his thumb across her cheek. "You make all the noise fade." It felt like fate. For a girl who had grown up counting pennies, his ambition was dazzling. For a man clawing his way into high society, her innocence was refreshing. Within a year, she traded auditions for a small piano studio, teaching neighborhood children instead of chasing stages. Within 2, she was Mrs. Richard Hale. Her friends had raised eyebrows. Why dim her own light for a man so consumed by his? Lillian only smiled. Love isn't about spotlights. It's about building something together. For years, she believed it. She believed it as she hosted his business dinners in their Manhattan townhouse, wearing the gowns he picked for her. She believed it as she left her own dreams in boxes beneath the bed, sheet music yellowing with time. She believed it every time he said, "Next year will be different, Lily. Next year will slow down." But next year never came. Instead came late nights, client meetings that stretched till dawn, the scent of perfume not her own on his suits. She told herself it was stress, that men in his world lived like that. She waited, patient, faithful, carrying the weight of his absence in silence. And when the test showed 2 pink lines, she smiled through tears, certain this child would bring him back to her. For a moment, it had. Richard kissed her forehead, promised they would be a family, spoke of nurseries painted sky blue or soft lavender. She let herself hope. But hope had drowned in the Atlantic with her. Now, in the hospital room, Lillian stared at the ceiling tiles as memories surged. Her mother's music, Richard's first kiss, the way he had once tucked her hair behind her ear, as if she were the only woman alive. How had those hands chosen to pull another from the sea while leaving her to sink? A soft knock broke the silence. A nurse stepped in, her eyes kind but heavy with pity. "Mrs. Hale," she said gently, "your husband is outside. Do you want me to let him in?" Lillian's stomach clenched. Husband. The word tasted like ash. Moments later, Richard entered. His suit was pressed, his hair immaculately styled, as though he had just come from another gala. Not a trace of seawater remained. Only his cologne, sharp and suffocating, lingered in the sterile air. He didn't rush to her side. He didn't take her hand. He simply stood at the foot of the bed, eyes flicking to the monitor, then back to her face. "You're alive," he said flatly, almost as if it were an inconvenience. Then with a sigh, "Lily, you have to understand. Everyone was watching. Vanessa panicked, and if I hadn't—" Lillian turned her face away, her jaw trembling. He was explaining, justifying, already shaping the narrative that would absolve him. But nothing could rewrite what she had seen, his body diving toward Vanessa, his arms shielding her, while his wife fought the ocean alone. Tears slid silently down her cheeks, soaking the pillow. She didn't beg, she didn't argue. Something inside her had cracked too deeply for words. Richard exhaled, irritated by her silence. "Don't make this harder than it is. You're strong. You'll get over it. And for God's sake, don't tell anyone about losing the baby. It'll ruin everything we've built." The words struck harder than the waves ever could. She had lost her child. He had lost his soul. As the door closed behind him, Lillian pressed her hand to her stomach, to the emptiness that remained. Her body shook, but not with weakness, with the first tremors of something fierce awakening inside her. The woman who once gave up her spotlight for love was gone. The woman who drowned was gone. What would rise in her place would not be silent. And somewhere beyond those hospital walls, destiny was already moving. A man from her past, Ethan Ward, was about to re-enter her life, carrying the power Richard never imagined she could wield. The city of Miami glittered like a jewel that night, the skyline carved against the velvet horizon. Skyscrapers shimmered with glass and neon, while the harbor pulsed with life. Yachts bobbed under strings of fairy lights, each vessel competing to prove who held more power, more influence, more secrets. But none outshone the Hale Foundation's gala yacht, an ocean palace worth more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. It was a ship designed to impress. Golden chandeliers swayed gently with the tide, their light scattering across marble floors flown in from Italy. Velvet curtains framed glass doors that opened onto terraces draped with orchids. Champagne fountains sparkled, caviar pyramids towered on silver trays, and a live jazz orchestra played as if even the Atlantic bowed to their rhythm. Guests in gowns and tuxedos drifted through the glittering maze, their laughter sharp as crystal. From the outside, the yacht embodied triumph, yet beneath the perfume and polished smiles, cracks pulsed like veins. For Richard Hale, the evening was more than philanthropy. It was spectacle, a coronation of his ambition. Every camera flash was a stone in the empire he wanted the world to see. And standing at his side, Vanessa Brooks, his mistress, wore her crimson gown like a crown jewel, daring anyone to question her place. To the world, they looked invincible. To Lillian Carter, it felt like exile in plain sight. Hours before the fall into the ocean, Lillian had arrived quietly, stepping onto the gangway as photographers swarmed Richard and Vanessa. Their laughter carried over the crowd like champagne bubbles, shallow and intoxicating. Lillian walked alone, her pale silk gown hugging the curve of her stomach, her heels tapping against the polished deck. Cameras barely noticed her, as though she were a shadow in her own marriage. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Chatter revolved around stock prices, real estate empires, and private jets. Waiters glided with trays of foie gras and oysters, their faces impassive as million-dollar deals were whispered over crystal glasses. To the guests, suffering was abstract, a statistic for a speech, never a lived experience. Yet in one corner, away from the chandelier's glare, Lillian had found a sliver of silence. She rested against the railing, letting the ocean breeze cool her burning cheeks. Her fingers brushed her belly. She whispered promises only her child could hear. "You will never feel alone. I will protect you, even if the world turns its back." The irony was cruel. Hours later, the world did turn its back. But before that tragedy, the gala itself had staged the perfect theater for betrayal. Richard played the role of host flawlessly, striding through clusters of investors with his arm glued to Vanessa's waist. He clinked glasses, posed for cameras, spun grand promises of expansion. Each gesture was a performance, rehearsed and deliberate. Guests ate it up, too blinded by his rising star to notice the storm brewing beneath the surface. And yet, not everyone was fooled. Among the guests was a figure who watched with quiet intensity, Ethan Ward. The reclusive tech magnate had slipped onto the yacht with little fanfare. His tailored navy suit was understated compared to the flamboyance around him, but the room shifted subtly when he entered. Power didn't always need volume. Sometimes it was carried in silence, in the way eyes followed him, in the whispers that trailed his name. Ethan had not come for Richard. He had come because the Foundation's work intersected with one of his philanthropic ventures. But when his gaze landed on Lillian, standing alone by the railing, something inside him stilled. He recognized her instantly. Years had passed since Juilliard, since the girl with music in her veins had filled rehearsal halls with emotion. She was different now. Her shoulders heavier, her eyes dimmed, yet it was her. Lillian Carter, the girl who once turned a crowded hall silent with nothing but a piano and her soul. He opened his mouth to greet her, but the crowd surged, and Richard's booming voice stole attention once again. "Tonight," Richard declared from the stage, spotlight painting him in gold, "we honor vision, we honor ambition, we honor those bold enough to shape the future." His words rang hollow to Lillian, but the audience erupted in applause. Vanessa leaned close, kissed his cheek, and the cameras captured the moment like a coronation. Lillian felt her knees weaken. This was supposed to be their moment, her family's. Instead, she stood erased from her own story. The orchestra swelled, couples twirled across the dance floor, diamonds flashing with every spin. Outside, the wind thickened, waves slapping harder against the hull. The Atlantic murmured warnings no one cared to hear. Lillian slipped further toward the deck, craving air. She pressed her hands to the railing, the scent of salt cutting through the cloying perfume of the gala. For a fleeting second, she imagined escape, stepping off the yacht, leaving behind the cameras, the whispers, the betrayal. Freedom waited in the dark horizon, if only she were brave enough. But fate was swifter than choice. The champagne bottle shattered. Vanessa stumbled. A chain of gasps rippled through the crowd as sequins and silk blurred into panic. In seconds, two women toppled into the ocean, one carrying life, the other carrying vanity. The gala froze. Music died mid-note. Spotlights whirled over the waves. And as Richard Hale made his choice to leap after Vanessa, leaving his wife to the mercy of the sea, the gala became more than a party. It became a stage for ruin. The cameras that had glorified Richard's speeches now captured chaos. The same guests who cheered his ambition now whispered behind manicured hands. The whispers spread like wildfire. He saved the mistress. He left his wife. Though many would later claim they hadn't seen clearly, the truth was burned into memory. The setting that was meant to crown Richard Hale's greatness instead scripted his downfall. And high above the dark waves where Lillian fought for breath, Ethan Ward clenched the railing. His jaw tightened as he watched her struggle, the woman he once knew being erased before the world's eyes. He had stayed silent for years, watching her disappear into Richard's shadow. But in that moment, something shifted. The gala's lights burned brighter, but Ethan's resolve burned hotter. This was not the last time Richard Hale would humiliate Lillian Carter, but it would be the last time she faced it alone. Because what began on a glittering yacht in Miami would spiral into a reckoning neither Richard nor Vanessa could escape. Richard Hale was a man who believed in two things: appearances and ambition. To the world, he was the embodiment of success. A real estate mogul whose name appeared in Forbes, a man who could walk into any boardroom and silence rivals with a single smirk. But behind the polished image was something darker, something sharper. He had built his empire not just with strategy, but with ruthless calculation, stepping on anyone who slowed him down. For Richard, love was never about devotion. It was about utility. Lillian Carter had once been useful, an innocent beauty who softened his image, a devoted wife who polished his reputation as a family man. Investors loved the story of the self-made billionaire married to a gentle piano teacher. She made him relatable, approachable, even trustworthy. But as the years passed, usefulness was no longer enough. Richard wanted fire. Richard wanted spectacle. And he found it in Vanessa Brooks. Vanessa was everything Lillian was not. She was bold, unapologetic, and hungry. At 26, she had clawed her way from a small-town PR internship into the arms of one of the city's most powerful men. She understood the power of perception better than anyone. Every dress she wore, every laugh she delivered, every calculated touch of Richard's arm was a performance. Where Lillian brought quiet grace, Vanessa brought a storm designed to be noticed. To Richard, she was not just a lover, she was a weapon. With Vanessa on his arm, he felt unstoppable. She fueled his ego, whispered strategies into his ear, and dared him to take risks others called reckless. Together, they were a firestorm, destructive, intoxicating, and utterly careless of the ashes they left behind. That night on the yacht, as guests raised their glasses, Vanessa played her role to perfection. Her crimson gown shimmered under the chandeliers, her lips curved in a smile that was both invitation and provocation. Every gesture screamed possession. She wasn't just at Richard's side, she was staking her claim before the entire city. And Richard let her. He knew the whispers swirling through the crowd. Isn't his wife pregnant? Why is he parading that woman around? But he thrived on scandal. Attention, even negative, kept him relevant. For Richard, there was no such thing as bad press, only free publicity. If anything, humiliating Lillian in public sent a message. He wasn't bound by anyone's expectations, not even those of his own wife. Lillian, watching from the corner, had felt each gesture like a blade. But to Richard, her suffering wasn't tragedy, it was strategy. He thought she would endure it quietly, as she always had. He counted on her silence, her loyalty, her fear of scandal. He believed she would never fight back. Vanessa, however, took it further. She relished Lillian's pain. Every time their eyes met across the deck, Vanessa's smile widened, dripping with mockery. To her, Lillian was nothing but an obstacle, a relic of Richard's past. Vanessa wanted to erase her completely, to become not just his mistress but his wife, the woman photographed at his side in every headline. And she was not afraid to play dirty. Behind the scenes, Vanessa had begun planting seeds of manipulation. She whispered to Richard that Lillian was weak, fragile, unfit to stand beside a man destined for greatness. She spun stories about investors who doubted him because his wife lacked sophistication, about board members who questioned his judgment because he clung to a woman from a modest background. Whether these rumors were true didn't matter. Richard, drunk on ambition, believed her. The cruel irony was that Lillian carried his child, yet Vanessa convinced him that the child was a burden, a chain that would slow him down. "You need freedom, Richard," she purred one night, her hand tracing his jaw. "You need someone who pushes you forward, not someone who holds you back with diapers and bedtime stories." And Richard listened. That was why, when the Atlantic swallowed both women, his instincts were not to save the mother of his unborn child, but to rescue Vanessa, the woman who made him feel invincible. The cameras captured him clutching Vanessa like a hero, his soaked shirt clinging to his muscles, while Lillian sank into darkness. To the crowd, it was shocking. To Richard, it was natural. He had already chosen which future he wanted, and it wasn't the one with his wife. But what neither Richard nor Vanessa understood was that their arrogance had set a stage larger than themselves. The gala guests had seen, investors had whispered, cameras had clicked. In trying to showcase his power, Richard had revealed his cruelty. In trying to flaunt her victory, Vanessa had exposed her shamelessness. They thought they were untouchable, but reputations like empires can crumble overnight. In the days that followed, Richard doubled down. He visited Lillian in the hospital not out of love, but to control the narrative. "Keep quiet," he warned her, his tone more like a CEO addressing a liability than a husband speaking to a grieving wife. "If word gets out that I left you, it'll ruin everything. Think of the company. Think of the headlines." Vanessa, meanwhile, basked in the chaos. She played the victim in hushed tones to the press, pretending the fall had traumatized her, painting Richard as her savior. She knew sympathy would only secure her place at his side. Her crocodile tears, her trembling hands, every performance tightened her grip on him. To the outside world, they looked united, powerful, untouchable. But behind closed doors, their foundation was already cracking. Because while Richard and Vanessa schemed, they underestimated the woman they had discarded. They thought Lillian's silence meant defeat. They thought her pain would chain her forever. They thought the ocean had broken her. They were wrong. Even as Richard basked in false applause and Vanessa sharpened her claws, another force stirred quietly in the shadows. Ethan Ward, the man they had barely noticed, had seen everything. And unlike the crowd, he would not forget. Richard Hale and Vanessa Brooks believed they had buried Lillian Carter. But in truth, they had forged her. And when she rose, it would be their empire that drowned. The news broke before dawn. By the time sunlight spilled across Manhattan, headlines screamed the scandal that had unfolded on the glittering waters of Miami. Billionaire Richard Hale leaps to save Mistress during gala disaster. Pregnant wife struggles alone. Society gala turns to scandal. Who did Hale choose? Every tabloid, every morning show, every gossip column plastered the same images. Richard dragging a drenched Vanessa Brooks onto the yacht, her crimson gown clinging like a second skin, her hands clutched around his neck. His face, noble in profile, looked like the perfect hero's mask. But in the corner of one photo, blurred yet undeniable, was Lillian Carter's hand reaching out from the waves, moments before she slipped beneath. The public devoured it. Talk shows debated whether Richard had acted instinctively or selfishly. Social media raged with hashtags, Save Your Wife, Team Vanessa, Billionaire Scandal. The video, captured on a guest's phone, spread like wildfire. Vanessa screaming, Richard diving without hesitation, the spotlight illuminating everything, except the woman he left behind. By breakfast, Richard Hale's empire was on fire. At the hospital, Lillian lay pale and silent, her body weak, her soul bruised. The child she had dreamed of cradling was gone. But worse than the loss of her baby was the knowledge that the world now knew. She had been erased publicly, her humiliation televised, dissected, turned into entertainment. Strangers debated her worth on screens, judged her silence, mocked her fragility. When Richard arrived, flanked by his publicist, his first words weren't, "Are you all right?" They were, "We need to control the narrative." Lillian turned her face to the window, her eyes dry. She had no tears left. "Don't speak to the press," Richard continued, pacing. "They'll twist your words. Just stay quiet until this blows over. Vanessa and I." He caught himself, but the slip was already poison in the air. "I mean, we'll handle it," Lillian whispered. "We?" Richard sighed, as though she were the unreasonable one. "She nearly died, Lily. I couldn't just let her drown in front of everyone. Imagine the headlines if I hadn't acted. Investors would have panicked. It would have destroyed everything I've built." Her chest tightened. Not once had he mentioned their baby. Not once had he acknowledged her pain. To him, this wasn't tragedy. It was inconvenience. The door opened, and Vanessa swept in, a silk scarf wrapped around her damp hair, her eyes red but calculating. She gasped theatrically when she saw Lillian in bed. "Oh, Lillian, thank God you're all right," she breathed, clutching Richard's arm as though she might collapse without him. "We were so worried." The audacity made Lillian's stomach churn. Vanessa perched delicately on the chair beside Richard, her hand never leaving his sleeve. Every word was a performance, every glance angled as if cameras might be hidden in the walls. "We must all stay united," Vanessa said softly, squeezing Richard's hand. "The press loves a scandal, but if we show strength, if we stand together, they'll move on." United. Together. Lillian wanted to scream. She was the wife. She had carried his child. Yet here she sat, treated as the intruder in her own life, while the mistress dared to speak of unity. The humiliation burned deeper than salt water ever could. Later that evening, as Lillian was wheeled out of the hospital for tests, whispers followed her. Nurses glanced at their phones, eyes darting toward her belly, then back to her pale face. Some pitied her, others judged. One hushed voice muttered, "That's her. The wife he didn't save." The title clung to her like a scar. Back at the Hale townhouse, the nightmare worsened. Reporters camped outside the gates, flashbulbs bursting whenever a curtain twitched. Headlines multiplied. Rumors spread that Richard would divorce Lillian, that Vanessa was already moving into the penthouse. Editorials speculated whether a woman so weak could ever stand beside a man like Richard. Richard, furious at the negative press, blamed Lillian. "If you hadn't stumbled, none of this would have happened," he snapped one night, his tie loosened, his eyes bloodshot from whiskey. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for me?" Do you know how many calls I've had to take from shareholders? Lillian stared at him, numb. Our baby is gone. He froze for half a second, then looked away. You'll get over it. The words shattered something inside her. The next morning, the humiliation became complete. On the cover of a major magazine, splashed across every newsstand in the city, was the image of Richard and Vanessa leaving a charity dinner. He guided her into a limousine, his hand at the small of her back, his smile wide. The headline read, "Love triumphs over tragedy. Richard Hale and Vanessa Brooks, the city's new power couple." Lillian stood at the corner newsstand, the cold wind biting her cheeks as she stared at the glossy betrayal. Strangers passed, their eyes flicking from the magazine to her face. Some recognized her. A few shook their heads in pity. One whispered too loudly, "That's her. The one he left in the water." She felt stripped bare, her dignity auctioned to the highest bidder. That night, alone in the townhouse that felt less like a home and more like a gilded cage, Lillian collapsed on the floor of the nursery. The walls were painted soft lavender, tiny stars stenciled across the ceiling. The crib stood empty, mocking her. She pressed her forehead to the wooden bars, her body trembling. Her humiliation was complete. She had lost her child, she had lost her husband, and now, before the eyes of the world, she had lost her place as his wife. But in the silence of that nursery, something shifted. The humiliation that had broken her began to harden into resolve. She whispered to the emptiness, to the child she would never hold, "They think I'm weak. They think I'm finished. But they don't know me. They don't know what I'll become." Somewhere in the city, Ethan Ward sat in his office, watching the scandal unfold on his screens. His jaw tightened, his fist clenched. He remembered the girl with music in her soul, the woman who now sat broken on a nursery floor. And he swore to himself, this would not be her ending. For Richard and Vanessa, the humiliation was just a headline. For Lillian, it was the fire that would forge her rebirth. And when she rose, the world that mocked her would tremble. The Hale townhouse loomed like a mausoleum. Its marble floors gleamed, its chandeliers glittered, but every room was hollow, echoing with silence that mocked her. For years, Lillian had poured her soul into making this house a home. Fresh flowers on the dining table, music drifting from the piano, the faint smell of vanilla candles she lit every evening. Now the flowers withered in their vases, the piano was shut tight, and the air smelled only of loneliness. Her humiliation had been public. Her grief was private, and both were unbearable. She spent hours in the nursery, the lavender walls pressing in on her like a cruel reminder. Tiny socks folded neatly in drawers, storybooks stacked beside the crib, a rocking chair waiting for lullabies that would never come. She traced the painted stars on the wall with trembling fingers, whispering to the child who was gone, "I'm sorry. I should have fought harder. I should have been stronger." But there was no reply, only silence, broken by the distant murmur of Richard's voice on the phone. Always Vanessa's name, always whispered laughter, always another betrayal echoing through the halls. Days blurred. Food lost its taste. Sleep came in broken fragments filled with nightmares of drowning, of reaching for Richard's hand and finding only emptiness. She woke with her chest aching, her body heavy as stone. Sometimes she didn't rise at all. Her friends, once vibrant threads in her life, had fallen away under Richard's influence. He had discouraged them, calling them distractions. Now, when she reached for her phone, her contact list felt like ghosts. Names she could dial, but voices she no longer trusted to answer. The world outside was merciless. Every magazine cover, every flashing screen seemed to scream her failure. Paparazzi lurked at the gates, waiting to capture her defeat. Headlines painted her as fragile, pitiful, irrelevant. She couldn't step outside without hearing whispers. That's her. The one he left in the ocean. Her collapse was total. One night, unable to bear the suffocating walls, she wandered barefoot through the townhouse, her gown trailing like a shadow. She found herself in the music room where her mother's piano sat untouched. She lowered herself onto the bench, her fingers hovering above the keys. For years, music had been her refuge. But when she pressed down, the sound cracked like her heart, hollow, broken, useless. She slammed the lid shut and buried her face in her hands. That was when Richard walked in. He smelled of expensive cologne and champagne, his tie loosened, his smile smug. Vanessa's lipstick still stained the collar of his shirt. He looked at Lillian not with love, not even with pity, but with irritation. "You can't keep moping like this," he said flatly, pouring himself a glass of scotch. "It's embarrassing. People are watching. Investors are nervous. Do you think I can run an empire with my wife crying on the floor like some tragic widow?" Lillian lifted her head slowly, her eyes red, her cheeks streaked with tears. "I lost our child, Richard." He swirled his drink, unimpressed. "And I lost $500 million in stock value this week. We all have burdens." The cruelty stunned her, but it no longer surprised her. She stared at him, hollow, realizing the man she had once loved had died long before their baby. What stood before her was a stranger who wore her husband's face but none of his soul. After he left, slamming the door behind him, Lillian collapsed on the floor. She pressed her palms to the cold marble, the tears flooding freely now. For the first time, she whispered the thought that had been growing like poison in her chest. "I can't survive this." The despair was a tide, pulling her under, drowning her in hopelessness. She curled against the floor, her breath ragged, her body trembling. Hours passed. The house swallowed her cries, just as the ocean once had. But in that silence, something unexpected happened. Her mind drifted back to her childhood, to the tiny house in Savannah. She saw her mother at the piano, smiling gently as she guided her hands over the keys. She heard her father's voice, steady and strong, telling her, "Lily, when life knocks you down, you don't stay down. You get up, you fight back." She remembered Juilliard, the way music had once made her feel invincible. She remembered laughter with friends, her younger self filled with dreams untarnished by betrayal. She remembered a boy named Ethan Ward, who used to sit in the back of rehearsal halls, clapping the loudest when she played, telling her she had a gift the world would never forget. And for the first time in weeks, Lillian's sobs slowed. She realized she had been measuring herself by Richard's shadow for too long. She had built her life around his ambition, his approval, his love. Without him, she thought she was nothing. But maybe, just maybe, his absence revealed the truth. She was more. She had always been more. Her body still ached, her heart still bled, but deep inside a spark flickered, weak, fragile, but alive. That night, she rose from the floor. She walked back to the nursery, placed her hand on the crib, and whispered, "I will not die here. I will not let him bury me." The collapse had been brutal, stripping her of everything. But in the ruins, the foundation of something new trembled awake. And outside, beyond the townhouse walls, forces were already shifting. Ethan Ward had begun making calls. He had seen the scandal, the betrayal, the humiliation. And unlike Richard, Ethan had not forgotten who Lillian truly was. Her collapse was not the end. It was the silence before the storm. And soon, Richard and Vanessa would learn that the woman they left to drown was not gone. She was only gathering strength. The storm had stripped her down to nothing. But sometimes it takes ruin to prepare the ground for rebirth. Lillian Carter had collapsed, but she was still breathing. And somewhere in the heart of Manhattan, someone else was watching. Someone who had not forgotten the girl she once was. Ethan Ward. The world knew him as the enigmatic CEO of Ward Technologies, a self-made billionaire who turned a garage startup into an empire that powered half the country's digital backbone. But long before the headlines, long before the wealth, he had been Ethan. The boy who sat in the back of Juilliard's practice rooms, listening to Lillian's fingers dance across ivory keys. He had loved her then, quietly, fiercely, knowing she belonged to someone else. And when she married Richard Hale, Ethan had stepped aside, swallowing his own heart. But he had never stopped watching from the shadows, never stopped admiring the music that had once filled entire halls with emotion. When the scandal broke, when the images of Richard saving Vanessa while Lillian vanished beneath the waves flooded every screen, Ethan felt a fury he had buried for years ignite like wildfire. He remembered the girl who had once made him believe in beauty, and he knew he could not stay silent any longer. 3 nights after the accident, Lillian sat alone in the townhouse library, surrounded by shelves of books she had never read. Richard was gone again, no doubt with Vanessa draped across his arm at some exclusive rooftop bar. The house creaked with emptiness, the kind that pressed down like a weight on her chest. A knock startled her, sharp, firm. She hesitated. Richard never knocked. When she opened the door, Ethan stood there. He was taller than she remembered, his frame broader, his presence commanding in the quiet night. His suit was sharp, his expression sharper, but his eyes, the same steady hazel eyes she had known years ago, softened the moment they landed on her. "Lily," he said, his voice low, steady, carrying her name like a promise. Her breath caught. For the first time in weeks, she felt her knees tremble not from grief, but from recognition. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" He stepped inside, his gaze sweeping across the hollow house. "I saw the news. The whole world saw the news." His jaw tightened. "I couldn't stay away." Tears welled before she could stop them. She turned, embarrassed, pressing her fingers to her face. "You shouldn't have come. You don't know what it's like." "I know exactly what it's like," he interrupted, his tone sharper now. "I watched a man choose a performance over the woman who gave him everything. I saw the way he left you. And I won't let him erase you, Lily. Not again." The words cracked something inside her. For so long she had been invisible, her pain dismissed, her worth diminished. And now, here was someone who saw her, not as a liability, not as a shadow, but as herself. She sank into a chair, her body trembling. "It's over, Ethan. My baby is gone. My marriage is gone. And the world thinks I'm pathetic." He crouched before her, his eyes locking onto hers with a fire she hadn't seen in years. "The world doesn't decide who you are. He doesn't decide who you are. You do." She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to, but despair clung to her like chains. "I don't have the strength," Ethan's voice softened. "You do. You just don't see it yet. But I do. I always have." Silence filled the room, thick and fragile. For the first time since the accident, Lillian let herself breathe fully. Then Ethan reached into his briefcase and slid a folder across the table. "There's something you need to know." She frowned, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside were documents, photos, reports, each page a blade. Financial statements, property transfers, emails, proof of Richard's schemes. "He's been moving assets into Vanessa's name," Ethan explained, his voice calm but lethal. "Shell companies, hidden accounts. He's preparing to cut you out completely." Lillian's chest tightened. The betrayal was deeper than she'd imagined. He's planning to leave me with nothing." "Yes," Ethan said. "But he underestimated you. He underestimated that you're not alone anymore." Her eyes lifted to his. "Why are you doing this for me?" For a moment, Ethan hesitated. Then his voice dropped, raw and unguarded. "Because I should have fought for you years ago. Because I let him take you from me. And because I won't make that mistake again." The room spun. She pressed her hand to her lips, overwhelmed by the weight of his confession, by the truth that had lived in his eyes all along. For the first time since the ocean swallowed her, hope flickered, small, fragile, but alive. She whispered, "What do I do?" Ethan leaned closer, his words deliberate, each one a seed of fire. "You rise, you stop hiding, you show the world who Lillian Carter really is, and when you're ready, we'll bring him down, together." Her hands trembled as she touched the folder again, the evidence that Richard's empire was built on betrayal. She thought of the nursery, the lavender walls, the empty crib. She thought of the humiliation, the headlines, the whispers, and slowly her grief began to twist into something sharper. Resolve. Richard had taken her child, her dignity, her voice, but she was still alive. And now she was no longer alone. She met Ethan's gaze, her voice steadier than it had been in weeks. "All right, let's burn his world down." Ethan's lips curved into the faintest smile, not of triumph but of recognition. "That's the Lillian I remember." In that moment, the collapse ended. The twist had begun. For Richard Hale, the choice he made on that yacht was the beginning of his empire's undoing. For Vanessa Brooks, the smug smile she wore that night would become her undoing. Because what they thought was victory was only the calm before a storm they could never contain. And at the center of that storm was Lillian Carter. No longer the forgotten wife, no longer the fragile woman drowning in despair. She was rising, and with Ethan Ward at her side, the reckoning was inevitable. The old Lillian Carter had drowned the night Richard Hale leapt into the water for another woman. The fragile wife, the grieving mother, the invisible figure in her husband's empire, she was gone. What rose from those ashes was someone different, someone sharper, someone who no longer begged for love but demanded respect. It began quietly. After Ethan's visit, the documents he left sat on the library table like silent weapons. Each page exposed Richard's deceit, hidden accounts, offshore transfers, fraudulent contracts. For 2 days, Lillian stared at them, fear battling fury. But the more she studied the proof, the more her sorrow twisted into purpose. If Richard thought she would be erased, he was wrong. On the 3rd morning, she opened the curtains of the townhouse for the first time in weeks. Sunlight streamed in, blinding at first but warm, alive. She caught her reflection in the window, pale, gaunt, eyes hollow, a ghost. She didn't recognize herself, and that realization cut deeper than any headline. She whispered into the silence, "No more." The first step was her appearance. For years, Richard had dictated how she dressed. Soft colors, conservative cuts, gowns that made her a background ornament. Lillian drove herself to Fifth Avenue, ignoring the paparazzi that swarmed her car. Inside a high-end boutique, she faced the mirror as a stylist draped her in a fitted black dress, sharp lines hugging her frame. She let her hair fall in loose waves instead of the restrained bun Richard always demanded. Red lipstick, bold and unapologetic, stained her mouth. When she looked again, she didn't see the forgotten wife. She saw a woman stepping into her own spotlight. The next step was reclaiming her voice. Ethan arranged a discreet meeting at one of his private offices in Midtown. Inside the glass tower overlooking the city, Lillian spread Richard's documents across the table. Ethan watched as she moved with newfound focus, her fingers tracing numbers, her mind sharp. "He thinks I don't understand finance," she said, her voice steady. "He always told me to leave the business to him, but I see it now. Every lie, every transfer." Ethan's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good, because knowledge is power, Lily, and you're holding enough to destroy him." She lifted her chin, a spark igniting in her eyes. "Then let's make sure he never sees it coming." But transformation wasn't only about strategy. It was about reclaiming life. One evening, Lillian returned to her piano. For weeks it had been silent, a coffin for the music that once defined her. She sat at the bench, her hands trembling, then pressed a single key. The note rang out, fragile but pure. She pressed another, and another. Soon the room filled with a melody, haunting, broken, but alive. Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't only of sorrow. They were of rebirth. Ethan, listening from the doorway, felt his chest tighten. The girl he once knew was returning, but she was different now, stronger, forged by fire. Word of her change spread quietly. When paparazzi captured her leaving a boutique in that sharp black dress, headlines shifted. From tragedy to triumph, Lillian Carter steps out in stunning new look. Is Richard Hale's wife preparing for a comeback? Public sympathy that once painted her as pitiful now began to twist into admiration. The narrative was changing, and Richard had no control over it. Meanwhile, Richard spiraled. His stock continued to plummet, investors whispered doubts, and Vanessa, though still at his side, grew restless. She hadn't expected Lillian to survive, let alone rise from humiliation with a power that threatened them both. One evening, Richard confronted Lillian at the townhouse. He stormed into the library, eyes blazing, Vanessa trailing behind in a silk robe. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he snapped, slamming a magazine onto the table. On the cover was Lillian in her new dress, walking with her head high, Ethan discreetly at her side. "You're embarrassing me. You're embarrassing this family." Lillian looked up calmly from her papers. "What family, Richard?" The words cut sharper than knives. Vanessa sneered, stepping forward. "You think a dress and some makeup make you powerful? You're still the woman he left in the water." Lillian rose slowly, her gaze locking onto Vanessa's with unflinching fire. "Yes, he left me, and I survived. But do you know what survival does, Vanessa? It makes you fearless, and you," she let her eyes sweep Vanessa's trembling frame, "are nothing without him." For the first time, Vanessa faltered, her smile cracking. Richard slammed his fist against the table. "Don't test me, Lillian. You'll lose." But Lillian didn't flinch. She leaned closer, her voice low but lethal. "I already lost everything, Richard. You can't break someone who's already been broken, and that makes me more dangerous than you'll ever be." Silence hung heavy. Richard's jaw clenched, but beneath his fury was something else, fear. That night, as he stormed out, Vanessa clinging to his arm, Ethan emerged from the shadows of the library. "You didn't just stand up to him," he said softly. "You declared war." Lillian exhaled, her hands trembling but her eyes steady. "Good. Let him come. I'm ready." The transformation was complete. She was no longer Richard Hale's silent wife. She was Lillian Carter, reborn, relentless, and prepared to reclaim everything stolen from her. The city that once pitied her now waited for her next move. The empire that had tried to erase her now trembled at her return. And Richard Hale, the man who thought he had buried her, would soon realize the truth. He hadn't drowned Lillian Carter. He had awakened her. The night of the Winter Charity Gala arrived like a storm cloaked in glitter. The ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria shimmered under cascading chandeliers, every inch dripping with wealth and vanity. The city's elite crowded the hall, their diamonds flashing, their conversations a chorus of ambition. It was the kind of event Richard Hale lived for, an opportunity to display power, to remind the world he was untouchable. But tonight, the stage he built would become his ruin. Richard entered with Vanessa Brooks clinging to his arm, her crimson gown echoing the night of the yacht. The cameras devoured them. To the press, they were still the scandalous pair, the couple who dared to flaunt love born from betrayal. Richard thrived in it, smiling broadly, waving as if he had conquered the headlines rather than drowned in them. Vanessa pressed closer, whispering sweet nothings crafted more for the audience than for him. Yet among the crowd, whispers had shifted. "Have you seen her?" a woman murmured to her companion. "She's here tonight?" "Lillian Carter?" the man replied, eyes widening. "Yes, and she looks different." The air tightened with anticipation. Every scandal-hungry guest craned their necks toward the grand staircase, and then she appeared. Lillian descended slowly, each step deliberate, her gown a cascade of black silk threaded with silver that shimmered like starlight. Her hair framed her face in soft waves, her lips painted a fierce crimson. The woman they once pitied was gone. In her place stood a vision of strength, beauty, and unshakable resolve. Cameras snapped wildly, gasps rippled across the ballroom. Richard froze, his smirk faltered, his jaw tightening. For the first time in months, he looked rattled. Vanessa's grip on his arm stiffened. Lillian reached the final step and paused, letting the silence envelop her. She raised her chin, eyes scanning the crowd before landing squarely on Richard. A faint smile touched her lips. Not warm, not forgiving, but sharp as a blade. Ethan Ward stepped beside her. Dressed in a midnight suit that radiated quiet authority, he offered his arm, and Lillian took it. Together, they walked into the lion's den. Two figures who commanded the room without needing to speak. The whispers grew louder. "She's with Ethan Ward? The billionaire? Oh, this is war." Richard clenched his fists. His empire was already cracking, his investors questioning his judgment. Now, seeing his wife, no, his ex-wife in everything but paperwork, standing radiant beside his greatest business rival, was a humiliation he hadn't calculated for. The evening unfolded in glittering excess. Wine poured, violins played, speeches droned. But tension built with every passing minute, everyone waiting for the collision they knew was inevitable. It came when the host called Richard to the stage. He rose confidently, dragging Vanessa with him, and adjusted the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice polished, "tonight is about generosity, about building futures." "Funny," Lillian's voice rang clear across the hall, cutting through the applause. "You speak of building futures when you destroyed mine." The room stilled. Cameras whirred, flashes erupted. Richard froze, his grip tightening on the podium. "Lillian," he hissed through clenched teeth, "sit down." But she didn't. She stepped forward, Ethan beside her, and mounted the stage. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, eyes wide, hungry for blood. Lillian faced the audience, her posture regal, her voice unwavering. "Months ago, this man left me to drown while he saved another woman. He let me lose my child. He humiliated me before the world." Her eyes swept the stunned faces. "And while you all debated whether it was instinct or betrayal, he was transferring millions into offshore accounts, hiding assets, preparing to discard me completely." Gasps rippled. Journalists scribbled furiously, microphones thrust forward. Ethan stepped up, his voice calm but deadly. "I have documents that prove it. Shell companies in Vanessa Brooks's name, fraudulent contracts, embezzlement masked as philanthropy. Richard Hale's empire isn't built on vision, it's built on deceit." The ballroom erupted. Voices clashed, cameras flashed, guests surged forward to catch every word. Richard's face drained of color. "That's a lie," he roared, slamming his fist on the podium. "She's bitter. She's—" "Don't," Lillian cut in sharply, her voice slicing through his fury. "Don't you dare call me bitter for speaking the truth. You left me in the ocean, Richard. You left our child. You can deny your crimes, but you can't erase what the world saw. Vanessa tried to step forward, her voice trembling. This is ridiculous. She's just... Lillian turned, her gaze pinning her like a dagger. You think wearing his arm makes you powerful? You're nothing but a pawn. He'll discard you the moment you stop being useful, just like he tried to discard me. The words hit harder than any slap. Vanessa's face crumbled, her mask of superiority cracking under the weight of truth. Richard lunged toward Lillian, rage boiling, but Ethan moved instantly, intercepting him with a steady hand on his chest. The two men locked eyes, silence thick with unspoken challenge. Richard faltered, not because he feared Ethan's strength, but because for the first time, he saw the room wasn't with him. The crowd was with her. Flashes blinded him, reporters shouted questions, guests muttered condemnation. Years of carefully crafted reputation unraveled in minutes. The king had been dethroned, not in private, but under chandeliers and cameras. Lillian didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply looked at Richard one final time, her eyes calm, her voice soft but devastating. You thought you buried me, but all you did was set me free. She stepped down from the stage, Ethan's hands steady at her back. The ballroom erupted into chaos behind them, reporters swarming Richard, Vanessa sobbing, investors storming out. But Lillian walked forward, unshaken, her head high. Her revenge was not a scream. It was not a fight. It was truth revealed in the one place Richard valued most, public perception. And in that world, he was finished. The woman he had left in the ocean had risen, and tonight, she drowned him instead. The fallout from the Winter Charity Gala rippled across the city like an earthquake. Overnight, Richard Hale's empire crumbled. Investors pulled out, boards resigned, headlines shifted from admiration to condemnation. Hale exposed Mistress, fraud, and betrayal. From mogul to monster, Richard Hale's public downfall. The video of the confrontation went viral. Millions watched as Lillian Carter, once dismissed as fragile, stood tall before the cameras, her voice steady, her truth undeniable. In living rooms and offices across America, people cheered. Mothers who had been abandoned, wives who had been betrayed, daughters who had been silenced. They saw themselves in her. Richard's attempts to fight back only worsened the damage. Each denial was met with another leaked document, another piece of evidence. His lawyers scrambled, but the walls closed in fast. Federal investigators launched inquiries. Whispers of indictments grew louder. Vanessa Brooks, once smug in her stolen spotlight, found herself shunned. Friends stopped answering calls, sponsors withdrew invitations. She had been Richard's trophy, and when his crown shattered, so did her status. Paparazzi captured her storming out of his penthouse, mascara streaked, screaming. The woman who mocked Lillian had become a footnote in Richard's ruin. Meanwhile, Lillian walked through the city with her head unbowed. For months, she had hidden behind curtains, shrinking from whispers. Now, people stopped her on the street not with pity, but with respect. Some hugged her, some whispered, "Thank you." She realized she had become more than a victim. She was a symbol. But victory wasn't just about destroying Richard. It was about reclaiming herself. In the weeks following the gala, Ethan Ward remained steadfast at her side. Not as her savior, but as her ally. Together, they met with lawyers, securing her rightful share of Richard's assets. With Ethan's guidance, she set up the Carter Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting women abandoned or silenced, women who needed voices as fierce as hers had become. The first press conference for the foundation was held in a modest hall, not a glittering ballroom. Lillian stood at the podium, her black dress replaced by a simple navy suit, her hands steady on the wood. Cameras flashed, microphones crowded, but her voice rang clear. "This isn't just my story," she said. "It belongs to every woman who has been left behind, dismissed, forgotten. I lost a child, I lost a marriage, but I did not lose myself. And tonight I tell every woman watching, you don't have to drown, you can rise." The applause thundered. That night, sitting alone in her apartment overlooking the city, Lillian finally allowed herself to breathe. For so long she had been defined by grief and betrayal. Now she felt something unfamiliar but welcome, peace. Yet there was one final chapter to close. Weeks later, she received a call from her lawyer. Richard had agreed to a meeting. He wanted to see her. Against her better judgment, she agreed. Not for reconciliation, there was none, but for closure. The meeting took place in a sterile law office, the city skyline looming behind tall windows. Richard sat across the table, his once commanding presence dimmed. His hair was unkempt, his suit wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot. For the first time in years, he looked small. "Lillian," he began, his voice cracking, "I made a mistake." She almost laughed. "A mistake?" "No. Drowning your wife, erasing her, stealing from her. That wasn't a mistake. It was a choice." "You didn't make one mistake, Richard," she said calmly. "You made hundreds, and you chose them, one after another." He flinched but pressed on. "I lost everything. The company, the money, Vanessa, all gone. But you," his eyes flickered desperate, "you could still come back. We could start over." Lillian leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Start over? You left me in the ocean. You let me lose our child, and then you paraded another woman through my grief. Do you think forgiveness erases that?" Richard swallowed hard. "I regret it every day." "Good," she replied simply. "Live with that regret, because I don't regret leaving you." She stood, sliding the divorce papers across the table. "This is the last time we speak. Goodbye, Richard." As she walked out, she felt lighter than she had in years. Behind her, Richard slumped, drowning now, not in water, but in the consequences of his own choices. Outside the building, Ethan was waiting. He didn't ask what had been said. He didn't need to. He simply offered his arm, and she took it. Weeks turned into months. The Carter Foundation flourished, helping countless women find their voices again. Lillian filled her apartment with music once more, her piano echoing with strength rather than sorrow. She still grieved her child, but she no longer carried the grief alone. One evening, Ethan invited her to a rooftop overlooking the city. The skyline glowed, the air crisp with spring. He handed her a glass of wine, his eyes steady, his smile soft. "You've built something incredible," he said. "Not just the foundation, yourself." She looked at him, her heart steady for the first time in a long time. "I couldn't have done it without you." He shook his head. "You always had it in you, Lily. I just reminded you." Silence stretched between them, warm and unspoken. Then, softly, she whispered, "Maybe it's time I stopped surviving and started living." Ethan reached for her hand. "Then let's live." For the first time in years, she let herself smile. Not for cameras, not for survival, but for herself. The city lights shimmered below, but they no longer felt like prisons of wealth and scandal. They felt like stars, guiding her toward a future she had claimed with her own strength. Richard Hale faded into headlines of disgrace. Vanessa Brooks disappeared into obscurity. But Lillian Carter rose higher than either had ever imagined. The woman who was left to drown had not only survived, she had rebuilt. She had reclaimed, she had risen. And her story closed not with loss, but with triumph. Because sometimes the greatest revenge is not destruction, but healing. And Lillian Carter had done both. So that's how the story comes to an end, my dear friends. And if you're still here with me right now, it means something in Lillian's journey touched your heart in a way that words can hardly explain. Maybe it was the pain of betrayal, maybe it was the strength she found in the middle of despair. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That's exactly what this story reminds us. Healing doesn't come from those who hurt us. It comes from the courage we choose to build inside ourselves. No matter how deep you've fallen, you can rise again. And if this story gave you even a little spark of hope or reflection, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who might need it, and don't forget to subscribe so we can keep walking through these powerful stories together.